Two Tuesdays ago, something from the side of my life I had paved over with asphalt and laurels knocked on my front door so loud the dogs woke up and started barking. I knew that sound even before I opened the peephole. It was the same thud as every old humiliation, the same thin confidence my parents always wore when they wanted something. I did not know then if they were asking or demanding. I only knew that the door felt like it would decide everything I had worked for, and I felt oddly thrilled and terrified at the same time. I have learned to tell stories for a living, and yet I could not place the ending of this one. I only knew that 15 years ago I left them the only way I could and that leaving saved me. It also made me a ghost to the people who raised me. My name is Elias. I tell stories on the internet for a living now. I build narrative soundscapes for true crime channels, pitch scripts to streaming services, and sometimes I narrate audiobooks into a microphone that will not judge me. My apartment sits above a used bookstore in a part of town that still smells faintly of rain and old paper. I have a partner named Sam who tells me I am tender in a way my mother called soft and my father called weak. Sam makes us breakfast on Saturdays and presses his forehead to mine when my nightmares spill into the night. I have a career that pays rent and then some, a little studio of mismatched lamps and framed maps where I write, and friends who know the difference between cause and fault. I have a therapist who taught me how to say my name without flinching. 15 years ago, none of that existed. 15 years ago, I was the family's punching bag. The scapegoat, the character in their house they pretended was a cautionary tale and not their responsibility. Growing up, they built a hierarchy like a trophy shelf. On the top sat my sister, Miriam, polished and untouchable. Bright grades, PTA smiles, the kind of person who could enter a room and make my parents' faces light in a way they never did for me. They called her golden and treated her mistakes like missteps on a stage, apologizing and repairing as if she were the fragile item. I was everything else. If a glass broke, it was my fault. If bills needed explaining, it was my fault. If a friend burned me on social media, I was the reason they'd done it. When my father wanted to make me smaller, he would tell a story about the bad son at dinner, and everyone would laugh with the right amount of pity. My mother taught Miriam how to clap and then how to point. Miriam learned to perform her benevolence like a skill. She would hand me tissues while the rest of the table rehearsed their disappointment. She would laugh loud when I was blamed and louder when I tried to explain. She kept receipts, literally and figuratively, and presented them like trophies against me. There were nights when I would lie awake and count the ways the house had eroded me. There was the time I was 12 and they announced at breakfast that I had stolen a necklace from my aunt. They whispered it like a moral lesson, pulled me into the kitchen, and made me cry until my eyes were raw. Miriam watched, throat working, feigning sadness, while my father insisted I reenact my guilt until I performed the apology they had scripted. Another time, my mother sent a photo of my bedroom to a relative with a note about my poor choices, smiling in her caption as if she were proud of the narrative. The abuses were not always violent. Most of them were surgical, precise cuts of words and omission. Isolation became a weapon. If I tried to speak up, the room would tilt into history they had created without me. They would say I was too sensitive. They would say I lacked perspective. The worst part was how my sister learned to mimic their righteousness. She would hand me lists of my alleged failures like homework, encouraging me to correct myself and then mocking my corrections later when she showed the list to others. Leaving felt like both cowardice and survival. At 23, I packed 3 boxes into the trunk of a cheap sedan and drove until the radio stopped sounding like it belonged to that house. My hands shook on the steering wheel because it felt like running away from a country I had failed. No one called me that night. No one tried to stop me beyond the thin, performative sadness Miriam put on the front lawn when I backed the car. For 15 years, I enforced one rule that saved me: no contact. No calls, no family events, no holidays near them. It was selfish and it was the only honest thing I could do. In those years, I learned to be my own father. I learned to make bad coffee and laugh at my own jokes. I learned therapy is not a frail thing but a toolbox. I learned that being loved is not a prize you must earn by being silent about pain. I learned to hold Sam's hand without waiting for permission. Healing was messy and unglamorous. It came in the form of late nights editing audio, of small apartments with scarves thrown over chair backs, of quiet breakfasts where nobody judged my cereal choices. It came with a promotion I had not believed I deserved, with a rent check that finally stopped feeling like a threat. It came with the rituals I invented to prove to myself that I belonged in the world: watering plants at 7, writing for half an hour every morning, spending 3 Sundays a year at my favorite pier feeding gulls. I cleaned my life of their calls and their expectations until my phone was nothing but light and the occasional voicemail from Sam's mother. That barrier felt fragile but sacred. I had friends come and go, careers that rose and dipped, but the silence where my family used to breathe felt like a room with locks on every window. So when someone knocked that hard 2 Tuesdays ago, I stood in the apartment doorway with the taste of exile and triumph in my mouth. I did not know if whatever they wanted would be a demand, an apology, or a rerun of every manipulation they had perfected over decades. What I knew was this: I had built a life they did not deserve to walk into uninvited. I had a partner who loved me with a patience my parents never modeled. I had a scarred version of myself that had learned to say no. The future was a little darker and a lot more complicated than it had been that morning, and I had stories to tell about how I had been erased from their picture. I was ready, or so I told myself, to tell those stories out loud. They arrived like a weather front, two shapes pushing across my threshold without asking permission and carrying the same old certainty that they could cross any border and it would still be their world. My mother smelled like cheap cologne and hospital soap, and my father wore a coat that had been ironed so many times the fabric looked like it belonged to someone else's life. Their faces had etched themselves with years, lines around the eyes, a slow slump to the shoulders, but their eyes were the same bright, small things that had learned to judge without blinking. The look that said they had a list and I was expected to be on it. Sam was by the stove when they walked in. He froze with a spatula in his hand, the eggs forgotten, and the dogs went from barking to a low, worried chorus. I felt the old protective muscle tighten around my chest, the one that had been trained to scan for how they would try to make me wrong. I said, "Okay, you cannot just," and my voice was steadier than I felt. My mother smiled like a woman who had practiced forgiveness in a mirror and never bothered to learn how to mean it. My father, with his hands like hammers, folded some papers and said, "We didn't want to do this like this, Ilias, but you left us no choice." They pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. They moved through the apartment like squatters remembering a past lease. My mother opened the little bookshelf and ran her fingers over the spines as if she could read the life I had made. My father took the framed map off the wall and held it up to the light. He tapped a spot on it where I used to say I wanted to travel and said, "You did better than we thought." He was smiling like a man offering praise, but there was a sting behind his teeth. It was the way people who had always been allowed to cross lines do it, with the confidence that everything they touched still belonged to them. They looked older, yes, but their manner was precisely the same. Their language had been sanded into practiced politeness that slid right back into command. My mother asked about Sam's job like she was checking a form, and the way she asked made him small. My father told a story from my childhood at the exact volume that used to turn neighbors into an audience and me into an exhibit. When I corrected him, he patted my shoulder the way you pat a dog when you've already made up your mind about it. Those little rituals were like acid, the old familiar burn I thought I had washed off. Then they stopped performing for a second and the voice my father used turned dangerous. "It's time," he said, "time for family to do what families do." The words were thick with a selfishness I remembered well. They had never done anything because it was the right thing, they had done everything because it fed their image of themselves. They believed sacrifice was a badge they could pin onto anyone else's chest. They asked for one thing but did not ask politely. They demanded that I answer. My mother had a folder. She handed it to me like she was offering a present. I almost refused. I almost told them to leave. But curiosity is a hard hook, especially when your life has been a museum of deleted memories. I took the folder and slid the pages out. Photographs, hospital letterheads, a pink slip of paper with a hospital ID number. My name was on a form. My name was on a match list. Somebody had already checked it and circled my file in a handwriting I recognized, because it was the handwriting that had scripted apologies for me all my childhood. She said the words like a woman reading instructions. "Miriam is sick," she told me. "We need you to help." They would not hear the refusal I had trained into my ribs for 15 years. The room tightened. Sam's hand found mine and squeezed so hard I tasted metal at the back of my tongue. My father's voice pitched soft and heavy. "You owe us," he said. "Family obligation," he added, as if those two words were currency I had spent without leaving a receipt. I thought of every single time they had used family to excuse cruelty. I thought about teenage nights when I had tried to explain feeling unsafe, and the way their faces had flattened into annoyance like they had been inconvenienced. I thought about Miriam at 15 handing me a paper list of the things I had done wrong and smiling as if she had performed a kindness. I remembered laughing at me behind hands. Now those same hands were folded, palms out, expecting me to give without a single recognition of the cost they had already exacted. They did not ask me to consider. They did not ask for time to think. My mother looked at me like a judge, a measure of guilt already decided. She told a story about phone calls, about doctors who had said tests had been run and that I was the only match, and her voice was dry like she had rehearsed the strings of a script that never included apologies. My father started to pace, and with each step he replayed the house I had left, as if that house could erase the space I had built here. They were aggressive with urgency, not with remorse. It was a tactic I knew too well. There was also in the edges of their story a smell of performance. They had prepared a narrative that cast them as desperate saints and me as the prodigal who had wandered too long. The folder had evidence and the air smelled of disinfectant and entitlement. My hands were steady as I read because shock is a neat anesthetic. Sam whispered my name, and I realized this was a crossroads I had imagined in therapy and avoided in practice. The folder heavy in my lap was heavy with a demand I had not agreed to carry. I could hear my own heart in my ears, and behind it, a litany of small violences I had been cataloging for years, like coins saved for a day when they might be spent on truth. They waited for me to say yes like they were waiting for a confession. Their eyes were hungry for absolution, for the reassurance that they had not wasted anything on me. The dogs circled my legs. My phone sat on the table. Through the hall I could hear the city being ordinary. From the apartment window, the rain-slick street reflected neon like a lie. I folded the paper back into the folder and held it between my hands. I had a voice, and for the first time in a long while, the words I wanted to use were not for their comfort. They did not ask. They announced it the way a judge reads a sentence, slow and final, like they already knew I would fold. My mother laid the folder on the table like she was setting down a fine china plate and said the words as if she were reading a script she had practiced in the mirror for weeks. "Miriam has leukemia," she said, "and you are the only bone marrow match." The syllables sounded like a hand slapping a ledger closed. They did not look for my face. They looked for my compliance. The folder was slick with hospital letterhead and stamps, sterile and clinical and impossible to argue with if you let yourself. There were pages with blood types, histocompatibility numbers, and the kinds of small print that swallow people whole when you are trying to breathe. They had photocopies of a sickbed photo of Miriam, thin and blinking under fluorescent lights, a child folded into her lap like a living apology. I did not know if my heart broke at the picture or recoiled at the sight of my sister being used as a prop. My mother said the timeline like a threat. The doctors said weeks, she said. Not months, weeks. The implication was clear: act now or lose her. They did not ask what my life looked like. They did not ask about Sam, who stood in the doorway with his hand pressed over his mouth like you do when you want to stop a scream. They did not ask about the steady work I had fought for, the quiet months of therapy, the small rituals that had taught me to trust mornings again. Neither of them paused to say sorry, not once. My father's voice slid around the apartment like he had laid wallpaper, seamless and wrong. "You owe the family," he said. "It's family duty. We raised you. We took care of you when you were young." The words fell like a trap snapping shut. Then my mother did something that felt like a betrayal of memory she had always owned. She presented a child to me as leverage. "Miriam's daughter Nora is 5 and has started asking why mommy is always in the hospital," she said. Their faces softened in the same way crocodiles look like they're feeling something. My first reaction was a cold, slow slide through the spine. I had never known Nora. I had never once held a birthday cake for her or been invited to a single recital. That knowledge made the demand hotter and messier. I could feel the neighborhood of my life I had locked up opening into a street I had never walked down. They produced a schedule on glossy paper. They had already called the transplant coordinator. "We can get him tested this week," my father said. "We can get clearance this week." The subtext was not hidden. The hospital needed a name and an appointment, and I was expected to sign my life up for surgery and recovery without asking anything in return. They assumed I would drop everything and become a donor because they had said so. They had always been that kind of owner of things. Property, time, favors, my humility. The arrogance felt like rust on an old knife. I wanted to laugh and then wanted to punch a wall. My hands, which had learned to type stories that gave strangers chills and made them think, were shaking because this was the clearest, ugliest demand I had ever faced. When I thought of every small cruelty, the way my mother turned my teenage failures into dinner stories, the way my father staged my apologies like plays, the way Miriam had once told a lie about me to a teacher to get me suspended, I could feel each incident stacking like coins on a counter, wait for a price I was expected to pay now. They asked for a miracle and had never offered a confession. My voice when I found it was quieter than I expected. I asked a simple question: "Did any of you think to ask me how I felt?" The silence was immediate and thick as pudding. My mother looked like a woman suddenly learning the words to a poem she had been pretending to know. My father tried to turn it into a moral lesson about sacrifice and duty and the glory of family. The way he said glory made me think of trophies and how he'd polished Miriam every time she did something acceptable. My sister had been raised to shine, and I had been raised to absorb light until my skin turned transparent. They turned to their tried and true tactic then, the one that had carved my childhood into a map of blame. They began telling versions of the past where I was indebted to them, stories where they had been saints and I the ingrate. The montage was familiar and infuriating, actions cropped out, lies left like weeds. When I corrected them, they smiled the way people smile when they are about to swallow you. My father reached for my arm like an old man trying to steady a painting, and it felt like ownership. Sam moved between us with an animal's protective motion, and my father stepped back because Sam's jaw said things my father did not like. Finally, my mother set the deadline like a gavel. "We need an answer in 48 hours, she said. "We are booking tests tomorrow. We are booking the coordinator." They expected me to be grateful for this mercy of negotiation. They expected my silence. They left the folder open like a wound on my coffee table and walked out into the rain as if they had done me a favor. I watched their taillights pass down the block, and the apartment returned to ordinary noise. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint siren far away, the dog padding back to my side. I picked up the phone they had left in a binder of papers and read the number of the transplant coordinator, then put the phone down again. The choice in front of me was not between saving a life and letting someone die. The choice was between becoming the person I had been forced to be for them and forcing them to become someone who could earn my help. I had a lifetime of reasons not to choose them. I sat them down because I wanted them to understand that this was not about a blood test or a calendar and a scalpel. I told my mother to wait on the couch and told my father to take his coat off like we were ending a performance. Then I said, "Call Miriam and tell her to come over." My voice was flat and quiet, and the silence that followed felt like the ocean holding its breath. When she arrived, she walked in like she was stepping into the last scene of a play she already knew how to win. She hugged my mother the way golden children hug when an audience is nearby, the practiced softness of people who never face consequence. I gestured to a chair and asked her to sit down facing me. I wanted to see her eyes without mirrors, without the polite smile she had trained for a lifetime. I told them I was going to say everything I remembered, every cut and small stone they had thrown at me, and I told them I would not be screaming. I wanted the clarity of a ledger, the cold arithmetic of counting wrongs. I told them to listen. I wanted to create a sound record in the room that could not be edited or softened later. When I began, I did not stumble. I had practiced this inside my own head for years, but practice and courage are not the same thing. I started with the simple things to make the pattern visible. "You told me at 9 that I was lazy for crying when my knee bled," I said. "You made me clean the kitchen with a toothbrush because real people earn bruises, and you told me it was discipline. You laughed when I explained that I was being bullied at school and called me dramatic when the same kids shoved me into lockers. My mother would stand at the window and say that I needed to grow thicker skin and then invite the boys for barbecues and call me sensitive for days. You made me eat apologies on plates shaped like punishments and handed my sister trophies for things she never had to apologize for. You took my things and made them into proof of my guilt. My father sold my first camera and told me he was teaching me responsibility. Miriam posted photos of herself wearing the jacket he sold with a caption about being generous as a family while I watched my rent check go missing. You told teachers I was unreliable and then brought up those same accusations at parent night as if you had saved the school from me. When I finally got a part-time job, my father turned up with a list of things I had broken and insisted the manager fire me in front of my coworkers for the sake of family honor. I learned to appear small when strangers watched. You lied to doctors about my history. When I had a bad allergic reaction to something the doctor prescribed, my mother told them I had been taking drugs, so they ignored my symptoms and blamed me for my own pain. You took my medical files and read them aloud at dinner like they were a show. You told relatives stories about my teenage mistakes in public places until strangers treated me like an unsolved problem. You used my therapist's notes as gossip material. I had appointments I would not have made were it not for hiding my fear of you in the waiting room. You accused me of stealing the watch my father had lost, and when the police came, you sat there and performed sadness while I was paraded outside in handcuffs. They did not press charges, but the university was told the story and I had a scholarship pulled without explanation. I sat in the parking lot and packed my things into my car, and everyone pretended that I had made a bad choice. Miriam smiled and said to a neighbor, "He always did cause trouble," and no one challenged her. That was the night I drove until the radio did not sound like the house anymore, and I couldn't tell if I was running from them or running toward myself. You erased my friendships and drove away my lovers with crooked stories. You showed up at parties I was invited to and whispered into ears that I had been untrustworthy. Miriam once called my employer with a false story about me being unreliable, and I lost my job that same week. When I confronted her, she laughed and said, "Welcome to the real world." You taught her that my failure made you proud because you were the family with standards. You taught her how to use my wounds as props. There were times you punished me with omission. You refused to help when I had a panic attack and then described me to others as overly dramatic and needy. You excluded me from holidays and then posted photos on social media titled "Family First" and wrote captions about how forgiveness heals everything. You never asked if apologies were wanted. You made me beg for crumbs of affection and then told everyone I was ungrateful for not kneeling when you offered scraps. Miriam, I said, and I turned my head to look straight at her, you were the one who stacked the accusations like bricks. You wrote letters to my teachers saying I had plagiarized essays you had read and then copied into your own notebooks. You invited my friends to your birthday party and then told them I had humiliated you, turning them away. You broke my guitar and then told people I had ruined it myself. You once publicly accused me of making you sick when you faked an illness to avoid a test, and everyone clapped for you for being so brave, while I stood in the hall receiving detention. You made me the house villain so you could be the heroine. I told them the last thing that had broken me open and made me leave. The humiliation that night when my father called the police and my mother gave a practiced cry to the neighbors, while Miriam handed a printed email to my boss with fabricated threats I was supposedly making. I said their accusations looked like papers when held up to the sun, and I had felt suffocated by how easily they could turn the world against me. That was the final blow. I said I left not because I was cowardly, but because I could no longer survive in a place that monetized shame. I watched them as I spoke, watching for cracks. My mother blinked like she had accidentally stepped out of a play and into real life. My father folded his hands the way men do when they are rehearsing control. Miriam's eyes changed a fraction. For the first time, I saw a moment of something that might be recognition, and then it slipped away. When I finished, I did not wait for them to apologize. I told them the only reason I had listened at all was to give them one chance to say the words that mattered. I am sorry, I didn't see, I was wrong. I gave them that moment and I watched to see if any of them could hold it. When I finished, I sat back and let the silence fill the room like a tide. Their faces were maps I had studied for years, and now I could see every route they'd taken to get there. For a long moment, none of them spoke. I let that stretch because silence is a truth teller. If they were going to change, it would show up in the small things. I wanted to see if anything in them had the weight of regret or if they still only had the habits of performance. When the silence felt about the size of a promise, I made it clear what I would do and what I would not. I said I would consider helping, but not for free and not for their convenience. I told them the favor I would consider carrying had to be earned. I asked for a public apology and not the soft, polished sort that gets handed out between silverware and Sunday calls. I wanted them to post on every platform they used a full, unedited account of what they had done to me, signed with their names and left pinned for 30 days. Not a vague "I'm sorry," but an itemized confession, naming the lies Miriam told, admitting the times my mother weaponized my medical records, acknowledging when my father staged my humiliation in front of neighbors and employers. I wanted details, dates, actions, and an admission that they had chosen performance over me. I wanted it to be searchable and unerasable so nobody could later say it had been a misunderstanding. I told them the apology had to include Miriam reading aloud in video form the specific lies she had told that ruined opportunities for me, naming the teachers and the instances, and that the video had to be posted on her account and left up for at least 30 days. I wanted their faces and their voices attached to their words. I wanted them to look at their own work in public light. I told them the apology had to be formatted in a way my lawyer could verify, because words without proof are just noise. Then I opened the ledger I had kept in my head and put numbers to it, so the ledger in my hands could be real. I told them every dollar they had taken when they pushed me out. The camera they sold for $520, the deposit for the apartment they insisted they had covered but never forwarded for $1,140, the scholarship holdup that cost me $4,000 in tuition because they convinced the board I had misrepresented grades, the stolen paychecks, and the moving help they promised and never gave. I read them the sum, the total of debts, and the compounded interest for 15 years, the small, creeping theft that had been normalized and called parenting. I told them exactly how they would repay it. Into an escrow account my attorney set up, funds to be used first to cover the money taken from me, and then with the remaining balance and interest to establish a trust for Nora's education. Because if they demanded my marrow, they could at least be forced into doing something adult with the money. I laid out logistics. The payments had to be made in full or into a verified, legally binding schedule with approved collateral. The apology posts had to be timestamped and notarized by a lawyer so they couldn't delete them later and say it had been a mistake. I put a 48-hour deadline on both actions. If the apology was not up and the funds not in escrow by the deadline, I said I would walk away and never speak to them again. No calls, no messages, no appearances at any hospital. I told them bluntly that the only way they would see me at a transplant table was if they publicly admitted what they'd done, and then paid back what they'd stolen, plus simple interest to account for 15 years of lost opportunities and harm. They reacted the way abusers always react when held to a ledger. My father barked and tried to turn it into a sermon about family loyalty, telling me I was being cruel for making them perform for strangers. My mother tried the softer route, pleading that this was about a human life, and appealed to my compassion and to every piece of decency I'd earned away from them. Miriam started to cry in the practiced way that had always angered me, and then she got quiet and said she would do anything to keep her daughter from being motherless. She moved to the emotional center where I was supposed to yield, and it was almost persuasive in the way only long-practiced manipulation is. I didn't flinch. I told them Nora's presence made the conditions even more necessary. If the apology were genuine and the money went to Nora's trust, it would prove they could put someone else's future ahead of their image. It would prove they could be responsible with the consequences of their choices. If they cheated and then I donated, they'd get the life they wanted without ever facing the truth. I would not be a bandage for a wound they refused to admit existed. They tried to bargain. My father offered an old watch he said was worth something. My mother offered private letters instead of a public post. Miriam offered to write a short note. Each concession was an attempt to shrink the requirement into something they could swallow without losing face. I rejected all of it. I told them small apologies meant nothing. Their cruelty had been public and so must be their answer. At one point, my mother lunged forward and grabbed my wrist like there was still ownership in skin. I did not pull away. Instead, I let my hand rest in hers long enough that she could feel the pulse of someone she had not controlled in 15 years. I told them their apology would not be for me alone. It would be for every neighbor, every teacher, every employer, every friend they had slandered with their stories. That made them angrier than anything else. They walked out in a kind of furious shame, slamming the door as if dramatic exits were currency. Miriam stood on the threshold and said she needed time, then turned and walked to the car without looking back. When they left, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder and the dogs curled at my feet. The ledger was closed but not erased. I had offered a path that demanded truth and reparations, and I knew how the rest of it would feel, raw, uncomfortable, public. That was the point. If they chose to meet me, it would cost them more than money. If they refused, it would cost them the one thing they'd always claimed to own, my forgiveness. I made coffee, called my lawyer, and started drafting a post to my followers I had not yet published. I gave them 48 hours and a list they had never expected to see in print. They recoiled like I'd shoved them. My mother put both hands to her mouth and made that noise people make when they want to sound shocked, as if surprise would absolve them. My father went from controlled to cornered in 2 breaths, an old scowl sliding back across his face like a mask he had kept in his pocket for emergencies. Miriam looked at me like she had been handed a script she had not rehearsed. For the first time, I saw fear in her gold-plated features. Then my mother found her voice and used the oldest trick in their book, the one that had always gotten applause, moral theater. You would let her die over money and pride, she said, eyes rimmed with tears that smelled faintly of perfume and calculation. The way she said it was supposed to make me fold. I sat very still because the image they wanted me to be was always reactive, always crumbling. I had spent 15 years practicing stillness until my body remembered not to tremble when they performed. You are letting her die over money and pride, I answered, and I said it slowly because I wanted the words to land on the table like coins, not sparks. All you have to do is tell the truth. The line came out of me like a thing freed, not cruel but final. They searched my face like they were looking for the boy they could intoxicate into apologizing. There was no such boy in me anymore. My father spat the word blackmail as if it were a prayer. My mother accused me of exploiting a sick woman for notoriety. Miriam covered her face and begged me to think of Nora as if a 5-year-old could make a list of my trauma disappear. Their pleas had been practiced in other rooms for other purposes. They knew how to turn guilt into a weapon and how to make strangers think the weapon was mine. My reply was simple: you used my life as a weapon for decades. I am asking for proof you can be trusted with another life. That is not blackmail, that is due diligence. They tried every angle. Their lawyerly panic turned to petty bargaining. My father offered to set up a trust with vague terms and no receipts. My mother offered a statement she called heartfelt, which she insisted she could delete later if it caused trouble. Miriam mouthed that she would post something, anything, just to end the shouting and the way the hospital lights now hung in the room like verdicts. Each concession was smaller than the last and smelled of loopholes and warm excuses. I had rehearsed a list of why those kinds of apologies would be worthless. Words you can delete are shadows. Promises without proof are empty shells. I told them if they wanted me to risk my body, my job, and my recovery time, they had to put their confession where the world could see it and where they could not unsee themselves. If they really wanted Nora to have a future, they had to show that they would put their image below a child's education. I read them the clause about notarized postings and escrow accounts. My voice was flat because I did not want my anger to soften into bargaining. Miriam's eyes filled in a different way then, not the practiced glisten of performance, but the quick, involuntary shine of someone tasting consequence for the first time. I saw her mouth try to shape an apology and then close because it would mean naming herself in public as the architect of my ruin. For a breath I thought she might break in the right direction. The police siren outside rolled like an omen, but inside the apartment a quieter judgment was taking form. They tried to turn things around by bringing up doctors and medical urgency, insisting that hospitals would not wait for their pride to be sorted online. I said that if this were truly about urgency, they would have come differently, softer, with only the single question of saving a life, not with the litany of ownership and backdoors they had brought with them. Urgency without truth is a cloak for secrecy. I told them quietly that I had done my own research and that I would verify the claims at the hospital. If the transplant coordinator told me Miriam would die unless I showed up that week, I would listen and then make a decision based on facts, not drama. I had not arrived at this moment in my life to be whipped around by someone else's guilt. Hurt slid into their faces in bands. My mother tried another shape, the small, exhausted woman who had made sacrifices, and I remarked that sacrifices had always been selective in the family. My father decided anger would serve better than shame and slammed his palm on the table, making the coffee cup jump. He called me selfish in a tone he'd used to excuse everything they'd ever done. I named each of those things again, just enough to make him wince. When did greed become charity, I asked, and why should I buy that switch at discount? At one point Miriam stepped forward and mouthed that she would do it, she would go on camera and speak, but my father squeezed her arm so hard she winced. His grip was older than the hospital folder. He said nothing, but the message was clear. She could be golden in public only if she was owned by him in private. That moment told me everything. This was never about saving a life as much as controlling the narrative of who loved whom and why. If they could have the life without losing face, they would take it without a confession. They left in a storm of phrases and slammed doors, their outrage like the echo of a theater curtain. Miriam hesitated at the car, turned as if divided between two loyalties, then slid into the driver's seat without having posted anything. My phone vibrated with a message from the hospital coordinator asking if I had a response, and Sam put his hand on my shoulder like a tally stick for my sanity. The choice was still mine, and for the first time since the knocking, I felt the shape of it clean and unambiguous. They were letting her die over money and pride unless they chose otherwise. All I had ever asked was that they tell the truth. They never did it. Instead of posting the apology and wiring the money like adults, they chose theater and smear. Within 12 hours of their leaving my apartment, they had spun a story for the neighborhood group chat and a private Facebook page they used like a church bulletin, calling me extortionist and cold-hearted, painting themselves as desperate angels. My phone filled with strange numbers. Sam's work email lit up with messages from people claiming to be concerned about my mental health. Someone left a flyer on my stoop with a grainy photo of me and words in big black letters, donor or demon. The message was obvious. Make me the monster so nobody asks why they never had to be honest before. They sent emails to clients and producers where I had worked, short notes that stitched together truth and fiction until the whole picture looked greasy. My father called in favors with a neighbor who owned a small blog and fed him an edited audio clip from the meeting, one where my words were taken and rearranged to look like threats. Miriam posted a tearful video captioned, "I begged him," and left out the parts where she had been the architect of the lies I spent years cataloging. People I barely knew messaged me as if my life had been a scandal I'd chosen to manufacture. It stung in a practical way. A potential job paused, a narration gig put on hold, and for a few hours I felt the old reflex of shrinking that had been educated into me. But I had not built my life on reflex. I had called my lawyer the afternoon they left. He had been blunt and efficient, the kind of man who speaks in deadlines and guarantees. He told me exactly what their next moves would look like before they made them, and that made their theater less effective. We compiled every scrap, screenshots of my mother's posts from years ago that joked about me, the text messages where my father promised to handle a job reference, bank statements showing the things they had sold or kept when I left, and a copy of the hospital correspondence they'd shown me. I had witnesses, old neighbors who remembered the staged apologies, a former manager who had been called with lies, and Sam, who had been there the whole time and knew how their voices rose. The lawyer wrote the letter like a hammer. It arrived at their house via certified mail and email and was attached to the online inbox of the accounts they were using to attack me. The letter detailed their defamatory posts, provided screenshots, and demanded immediate removal and a public retraction. It gave them 24 hours to take down the content, a week to fulfill my original conditions if they truly intended reconciliation, and warned sternly that continued harassment would result in immediate filing for a temporary restraining order and a civil suit for slander and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The letter was clinical and cruel in the only way that mattered to them. It enumerated consequences and put them in ink. I remember the moment I hit send to the lawyer. It was quieter than the knocking at my door had been. Sam held my hand and said nothing grand, just that he was proud. The lawyer also filed a formal complaint with the platforms hosting the smear. He attached timestamps and geolocations and told me how quickly a coordinated harassment claim could get posts deplatformed if the evidence was strong. I felt the course of things shift a degree to the right, not because I wanted vindication, but because I needed containment. They reacted with more theater. My mother posted a hysterical video and then sent letters to local churches accusing me of emotional cruelty. My father called a pastor and begged him to speak on their behalf. A private investigator started being oddly friendly with my building's doorman, asking questions about me and photographing my car license plate. It was small, ugly, and familiar, the feeling of someone scraping at the varnish of your life to see if the wood underneath would rot. I recorded everything, not as an act of paranoia but as a precaution. I had built a documentation pile because abusers always try to gaslight the paperwork away. 48 hours later, when the initial smear had not tilted my life into ruin, the law did what theater never could. It created a paper trail the police could use. The investigators' photos were not enough to prove any crime, and the digital platforms took down the slanderous posts after reviewing our submissions. The lawyer sent a final, formal refusal of their plea to consider the donation under those conditions, and enclosed a draft of a restraining order ready to file if they approached my home, my workplace, or contacted me or Sam again. The letter was explicit. Any appearance at my job site or attempts to contact my clients would be considered harassment requiring immediate legal response. He demanded they cease and desist from any further public statements about me until they issued a retraction and provided the escrow proof we had asked for. I did not delight in the legal machinery. I did not want to see them humiliated so much as I wanted boundaries that could not be walked through like open doors. But their choice to smear me had made the decision for me. When the officer from the local precinct called to ask for a statement and put their man on the line, I read the list of actions they had taken against me and the hours of recorded phone calls and messages into the log. The officer sounded tired but professional, and I felt a strange, steady confirmation that this time the small things I had kept, screenshots, receipts, names, would do the job they were meant to do. The next chapter was never about winning a popularity contest. It was about shutting the gate. The lawyer filed for the temporary restraining order with the court clerk that afternoon. The judge signed it in the evening, a small physical stamp that felt like a seal. I received the served paperwork 2 days later. The order forbade them from contacting me, coming within 500 feet of my home and workplace, and from continuing to post defamatory content. It was printed in blue ink, dry and final. When I walked past the window and saw Miriam in her car through the rain, she did not look up. The work was not revenge. It was a decision to protect the life I had made. I had demanded they meet me as adults, and they had answered by proving once again they had learned nothing at all. I changed my number that night and I blocked every account they had used to smear me, because silence is its own kind of armor, and because I had spent 15 years learning the difference between signal and noise. I did not announce the move or dramatize it. I unplugged the line like you turn off a faucet that has been leaking for years. The first week felt oddly loud in its absence. Notifications that used to pull me into old scripts no longer chimed. My phone no longer lighted up with strangers telling me what a monster I was. The absence felt like clean air after being in a basement too long. People asked if it had been hard, and the truth is it was both harder and easier than I expected. The impulse to check what they'd written at 2 in the morning was like a phantom limb. Sometimes my hands reached for the keys before my head could remind them I had already done the work. Sam sat with me in those hours and let me be as tired and petty and fierce as I needed to be. He made chicken soup and typed out emails to people who needed managing. He came to court with me for the restraining order and sat quietly in the back while I told the truth into the sterile microphone. The judge signed the order and the clerk stamped it with an official thunk, and for a small, blessed moment the world felt as if it had acknowledged my scars. A week after the order, the hospital called. It was not the transplant coordinator but another number I did not recognize. They told me Miriam had died. The voice was small and practiced and legal. I felt something in my chest make a sound like a drawer closing. There was no rage in me, not the hot, burning kind, but a cool, quiet sorrow that folded into itself. I could not say I was surprised. Pride had been a wall between us, thicker than any hospital room or deadline. Their refusal had been loud and peremptory enough to stop a match, and there was no miracle in that silence. After the call, the world narrowed to obvious things. Sam put his arms around me and we both cried, not because I had been proven right but because another human life had been lost to stubbornness and cowardice. I had not killed Miriam. I had not watched her die in any way I could own. Her parents' decisions and her inability to do a single brave thing, an honest post, a single named apology, had allowed the disease to finish before there was a practical route to save her. That truth was its own sorrow. I folded it like a letter and kept it in the drawer where I keep the receipts of my life, and I let it be part of the ledger I had already closed. Then something else arrived at my door, small and fumbling and very alive. A courier carrying a thin envelope with my name written in a hand that trembled. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph of a small girl with braids and a missing tooth. The note was not from my parents. It was from Miriam, left in a place she thought I might look because it was the rare place she had never tried to control. A used bookstore 2 blocks down that still had a bulletin board for things people wanted to say. The letter was short. It said I'm sorry, it said I was scared of Dad, it listed a few truths that matched lines I had said out loud in my living room, and it asked only that I not hate Nora. There was no flourish of contrition, no public theater, just 3 trembling sentences written by someone who had not had the courage for a camera but had had enough for a pen. That envelope changed everything in a small, quiet way. It did not erase the harm. It did not give me the apology I had demanded, witnessed, and notarized for the world to see. But it gave me evidence of something else. That Miriam had known at some level the truth. That she had wanted to say it and could not because the house we had both come from had a geography of fear she could not navigate. That fact made space for a complicated type of forgiveness inside me, not the kind that returns someone to your table, but the kind that removes the electric charge from their memory. The letter gave me permission to grieve her as a sister who had been both villain and victim. The messy, righteous closure came in another form I had not planned for. The state moved to assign guardianship for Nora because there was no one else trustworthy, and Miriam's parents were now legally constrained by my restraining order and ongoing slander suits. I spoke with a lawyer again. It was not an easy decision to step into a role that had been denied me before, but it felt right in a way the apology had not. I did not take Nora to replace anything. I took her because she was a child who deserved someone who would show up, who would not weaponize her existence for reputation. The court, looking at my records and the documented history, agreed to grant me visitation and then guardianship discussions. It was not a cinematic adoption with trumpets. It was paperwork and hearings and references. It was real work, and it was the kind of justice that teaches instead of headlines. I found myself building a different sort of family in the following months. Nora sat at my kitchen table and drew with my old pens and asked for help with spelling words I had once used to write scripts. Sam taught her to ride a bike. My friends who had stayed came over with casseroles and books and, in small mercies, baby gifts for a child I had not expected. I kept the restraining order in a file, and I called the police when Miriam's parents loitered too close to the park. Legal protection is a clumsy thing, but sometimes necessary when people cannot learn another lesson. In the quiet moments when Nora was sleeping and the apartment smelled like flour and crayons, I would sit and think about the life I almost lost to silence and how I had been given a second kind of chance. I did not celebrate Miriam's death like a victory. I felt the ache of all we had been and never could be. I did, however, allow myself to believe I had done something righteous in refusing to be blackmailed into a false reconciliation. Their pride and their refusal had held the knife, not me. I had set a price for help not because I am cruel, but because truth matters in the ledger of a life. I tell this now as a warning and as a benediction. Boundaries are not the same as cruelty. Saying no to people who have hurt you is sometimes the only way to build a life where laughter is not taxed and mornings do not come with the noise of an old house banging its shutters. I am not untouched. I carry scars like maps and a story like a compass. But I am surrounded by a family I chose. And each night when Nora falls asleep with her head on my shoulder and Sam reads in a voice that makes the room soft, I know I am living free from the ghosts that used to follow me to the front door.